Hello, Richard Pinner here, and this is a makeup lesson for the MA TESOL Materials Development class, and we're focusing on motivation today. That's the wrong subtitle. This is the correct one. Okay, so motivation. How does it work? How does it relate to materials? And do you think it's our job to motivate students? So to prepare for this lesson, I asked you to read the state-of-the-art article by Martin Lamb, who's a lovely bloke, and it's a really good paper all about the motivational dimension of language learning. So he talked about the four main types of research into L2 motivation. And I recommend that if you have any questions about this paper or any comments, please post them in the Coffee Room forum or in the comment section of the video. A very famous quote that is often used when talking about motivation is this one from Pitt Corder, often seen as the father of applied linguistics. He was the founder of the Journal of Applied Linguistics and very influential teacher and educator. And Pitt Corder says that given motivation, it's inevitable that a human being will learn a second language if he or she is exposed to the language data. Is this true? So there are many factors that influence your aptitude for language or your ability to learn another foreign language. But if you have the motivation and just stick at it, will you be successful ultimately? So if you want to know more about teaching and researching motivation, there's no better book than Donya Nishioda's. Most recently, the most recent version is 2022 third edition. Absolutely fantastic. This is the Bible, basically, if you're interested in teaching or researching motivation. If you're doing any aspect of motivation on your MA thesis, I recommend you pick up this book, and especially because I am personally mentioned on page 267 as who's who in motivation research. Myself and Richard Sampson got mentioned there for the East Asia section. But of course, I do know Emma Ushioda and I used to know Zoltan personally, so I think they were just being nice. I'm not sure if I really am a who's who. And also, Richard Sampson's more focused on emotion research these days anyway. But it's nice to be mentioned, and some of my papers are cited in this book. Okay, so let's just talk about what motivation is very simply. So if I show you this photograph and I ask you, what is this person's motivation for paddling? You're going to say to me, oh, well, it's a nice day, beautiful sky, clear blue sea. This person is paddling because they want to. They are intrinsically motivated. The motivation to paddle comes from within them. However, zoom out, we see the shark, and we realize actually that their motivation is different now. Now they have an external influence pushing them to paddle. So it's changed. So this is the essential difference between intrinsic motivation, which comes from inside, and extrinsic motivation, which comes from outside. So this was originally part of Gardner and Lambert's work on motivation in Canada in the 1960s. Now, I've been using this photograph to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for many, many years. However, it's not really an appropriate image to show this rather simplistic and dichotomous view of motivation. I first heard about this image when I was just Googling motivational memes and posters, as one does. And I got really interested in this image because I love sharks, and I used to teach it. I thought it would be good for intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, exactly as I just did in the previous slide. However, after a few years, I became myself unimpressed with the simplistic notion of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and I started looking into complexity approaches to motivation. But I was still using this picture to teach. And then one day I thought to myself, I've been using this picture for so many years. I should check out where this picture comes from. So a quick search online revealed that this picture was taken by a famous shark photographer called Thomas Peschack. And he actually wanted to create a book called People and Sharks. And so this whole thing was staged, really. Basically, the sharks weren't coming close to the boat so they could get photos. The sharks were scared of the engine noise from the boat or something. So Peschack suggested that they go out in a kayak, no engine, no noise. Maybe the sharks are going to come close to this boat. So everyone was like, great idea, Thomas. You go first. So Thomas gets in the canoe and the sharks come up to him and he's fine, so he gets out of the canoe, and this time a different researcher gets in, a guy called Trey Snow. This photo was taken in 2003. So back then they were still mainly using film cameras for good high quality shots. So Peschack only has a few rolls left in his film, and the shark's approaching the guy in the kayak, and something just made Peschack just pause for a moment. And in that moment, the researcher Trey Snow looked behind him and noticed the shark, and click, iconic photo was born. Now, why am I telling this story? The whole point is that the motivation for this person being in a kayak is not simply intrinsic or extrinsic or some combination of them both. If you want to understand these people's motivation, you need to know the story. And we'll be talking about the importance of context and narratives and personalizing motivational research shortly. What is motivation? Basically, it's why people do things. For language learning, it's often cited as the reason students are or are not successful. CF, the quote by Pit Corder. It's also cited as one of the main, it's also established through several research papers that one of the main factors that contributes to motivation has been repeatedly shown to be the teacher. That's right. So if you wonder whether it's our job to motivate students or not, well, perhaps we should expect them to reciprocate motivation. If we put in a lot of effort teaching, we should expect them to reciprocate that by allowing themselves to get motivated if we try to make our lessons motivating. But yes, we are central to motivation. If you don't like the teacher, you're not going to like the subject, you're not going to get motivated. Again, just to go over it, the historical theories of motivation tended to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You had intrinsic motivation, culture, I like manga, integration, I want to work in Japan. Whereas extrinsic motivations would be things like exams, you want to pass the TOEFL so that you can get a better job, or you have to study English because it's compulsory courses in your country. Then Deci and Ryan in 1985 proposed self-determination theory, and they talked more about integrative and instrumental motivations in an attempt to slightly avoid the dichotomous and essentializing nature of the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. One of the key points of self-determination theory is that it's built upon people having autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And people are more self-determined, more intrinsically motivated if they have these three core things. the control over what you do, the ability to feel that you can do what you are supposed to do, the competence to achieve it, and relatedness, which is a social aspect. So this means that you have friends, family, or other people in a social group that make it more interesting for you. Could also be connected to relevance as well, if this is something that's personally relevant or personally interesting to you. Now, I always thought that there was a connection there between relatedness and relevance. Sorry, I missed that on the previous slide. Relevance and autonomy. So I think that there's they do talk about autonomy a lot when they talk about self-determination theory. Another related theory, which also deals with the concept of authenticity, is Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory. Flow is basically being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies, every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz, or, in my case, like playing Red Dead Redemption 2 or Doom or some other awesome game. So people often experience this feeling of flow when they're doing something that they love or something that they enjoy, often something recreational. So educationalists are trying to work out how to bring flow into their classrooms. So there are not many, but a couple of interesting studies that have looked at flow in the language teaching classroom. This one by Tardy and Snyder, That's Why I Do It. This talks about teachers having a feeling of flow when the lesson's going well. And I think that that can also translate to the students as well, if there's a sort of social connection between these things, which I'll examine in a few slides later. One of the keys to understanding flow is how it's about balance. It's balancing challenge with skill. So if something is too challenging, you get anxiety. If something is not challenging enough, it's boring. So you need to have this fine line between skill and challenge, between boredom and anxiety, and that's where flow can happen. And this is why I think computer games are a good example of this. When you're playing a computer game on a difficult setting, you're just sort of challenged, but hopefully you know what you're doing enough to feel like you can achieve it. And then time flies away. But it's not passive. This is important. You don't get flow when you're watching Netflix. You don't experience flow really in situations where you're not doing much. If you're just sat passively watching or listening or watching a YouTube video of some boring lecturer tell you about flow, then you're not going to experience flow. Another interesting motivational theory concerns dynamic motivational. Sorry, it's not dynamic. This is a mistake on the slides. Directed motivational currents, DMCs. So directed motivational currents are related to flow, and their project length, they're much more long term. It's not just a state, but more like a strange attractor that you keep falling back into this state of wanting to work on something. And I experienced this when I was working on my first book, which was published in 2016. And I was actually one of Christine Muir's research participants. I did the study, and I think participated in her research into this because I was talking about my experience writing a book. However, in terms of foreign language learning, I've never had a DMC when learning a foreign language, unfortunately. I think some people have, though. And so if you can find a way to activate yourself on a directed motivational current, you're very likely to have long-term, successful, highly motivated experiences. So I recommend looking into these if you're interested in bigger projects that are related to flow. Now, no lecture on motivation in language learning and teaching would be complete without special honorary mention of Zoltan Dornier, who sadly died in 2022. And Dornier's most famous contribution is, of course, the L2 self system, which comprises learning experiences, your ought to self, and your ideal self. And this is pretty much based on another piece of work by Marcus and Neurius's Possible Selves, in which they also talked about this self-concept and how people see you in society, not wanting to disappoint other people, a more social aspect to it. Towards the end of Zoltan's life, he was also getting very interested in vision or positive visualization. And if you pick up any autobiography of any Olympic athlete or a successful person, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, in there you're going to find them talking about how they could see themselves winning. They could see themselves with the gold medal. They used to, every day when they dragged themselves out of bed, the first thought they had was the medal, the achievement, and they could see themselves winning it, visualizing themselves as successful. And this has a very profound effect on your ability to achieve what you want to achieve. It's very important to have this vision. So this was interesting work as well. Now, I said I would get onto context. So Emma Uchioda is really where context is really one of the people who highlighted the importance of context when studying motivation. Also in the same book that came out in 2009, in which Zoltan Dornier outlined his L2 motivational self in more detail. So the person in context relational view of motivation tries to emphasize the fact that learners are not just learners, they're actually people. They're people sitting in a classroom right now learning, but they also have other stuff going on. For example, how do you know that the person sitting at the back of the class staring out the window, you think they don't like English because they're bored, but actually their hamster just died and they're looking out the window sadly trying to forget about little Timmy the hamster or whatever, or they split up with their girlfriend. This is actually something that happened with one of Emma's PhD participants. This person had been learning French because they had a French girlfriend. French girlfriend dumped them. And normally you'd think that their motivation would go down with the dumping. But actually their motivation went up and they continued to study French. Who knows, maybe they went out to find another French lady to trample on their heart. But this realization made Emma notice that she needed to know more than just what's going on in the person's motivational life. She needed to understand the person in context. So we all know the importance of context. And these are really interesting papers that you can look up if you want to read more about Emma's views on person in context and the importance of making sure that you know what's going on in someone's life and how it relates. This is also why Emma doesn't really advocate a lot of large-scale quantitative surveys on motivation. She believes that the best, more rich data will come from qualitative understandings of motivation. Emma's work on motivation got me interested in group dynamics as well. So when I was working with Emma, she was my PhD supervisor, and I got very interested in the relationships, the social interactions between people in a group or in a class. So I wrote my PhD in 2017 and published it as a monograph in 2019, slightly modified with a few extra chapters. And one of the things that I added were network sociograms. Network sociograms were originally drawn with a piece of paper and a pencil in the 70s, and they were originally proposed by Marino, who was a French sociologist, but now you can use computer software to design these. Unfortunately, they're illegible, and I think they look amazing, but they take a long time to create. What we're looking at here is one of my classes where I planned every student and each student's relationships to each other. So if they have a thick line between them, that means they have a lot more relationships. If it's just a thin line between the nodes, the circles, if there's a thin line between the nodes, that means that they don't have a strong relationship, and a thicker line represents more relationships. This, despite its complexity, this is a classroom sociogram of a group of 25 students, and I only plotted 4 relationships. 1, whether they're in the same faculty. 2, whether they sit next to each other in the class. They could choose where they sit. 3, whether they work together on projects. And the 4th one was another type of project that they worked on. So 2 of them were classroom assessments. And those are the only 4 relationships that I plotted. It took me ages, but it did help me identify who are some of the isolates in the class, by which I mean students without very many relationships to other students who would sit at the back and not really participate. And I felt that this affected their motivation as well. So group dynamics and motivation is an interesting area for research. Another interesting aspect of Emma's work, which I also incorporated into mine, was metacognition. So Emma argues that it's really important to encourage reflection in students, get them to be as active in part of the motivation and lessons as possible, get them to reflect, get them to use metacognition to understand and strategize their own learning. Similarly, I was writing about self-assessments, and I've written 2 papers about this. And what I do in all my classes, for my undergraduate classes, is I have them write a self-assessment halfway through the semester and again at the end of the semester, where I actively have them setting themselves goals. Of course, we use SMART goals, and asking them to think about what they are good at and what they're achieving and what they want to achieve further. I'll come back to this shortly as well when I talk about motivational synergy. Of course, another aspect of motivation is sometimes called fun theory or gamification. There is a nice video on YouTube of the piano stairs, which were in Stockholm. But unfortunately, this is a Volkswagen advert. And as we know, Volkswagen lied about their emissions and were taken to court and sued. So they're not good for the environment and they're liars. So I'm not going to play the Volkswagen advert on this video, but it's a pretty cool project where they tried to get more people to use the stairs by making the stairs fun, by which I mean they turned it into a giant piano. So as I say, this is linked to gamification. Flow theory obviously is a big part of this, motivation in general, and also interesting book called Nudge Theory, which also talks about the way to get people to make the right choices by strategically giving them a push or a nudge in the right direction. So for example, you don't put chocolate bars at the checkout where people make impulse purchases, you put healthy snacks there. Another important aspect of motivation, I think, is this ability. We would be lost in the wilderness. So it's actually fairly accurate that you should be able to tell what other people are feeling or thinking if you're an empathic person or if you have high social and emotional intelligence. And a study by Christina Gonu and Sarah Mercer did actually identify that teachers who are good with social intelligence can actually improve their social and emotional intelligence with further experience. And I think that teachers become adept at understanding our students' feelings, emotions, and motivations. I did some research with some of teachers a few years back after a workshop on authenticity, and I was pleased to see that quite a few of them associated understanding more about themselves and their own beliefs as a motivating aspect as well. One of the things we emphasized in the workshop on authenticity was the importance of communicating your intentions with your students' intentions. And I think authenticity is obviously really linked to motivation because it's about personal identification, beliefs, and so on. This was covered in the previous lesson. So emotions are obviously crucial as well in motivation. And as I said, my colleague Richard Sampson's been researching motivation, and now he's moved into researching emotions. So there's a lot of links between these as well. Now, when I was researching for my PhD, I came across this short little quote by DC et al. In a chapter in a paper that they wrote in 1997 in a book called Teaching Well and Liking It. And they mentioned that the relationship between student and teacher motivation can either be positively or negatively synergistic. And this is what really got me thinking, and this ended up being the crux of my doctoral research. So I wanted to test that and see if it's true. So one thing I noticed was that in my classes, sometimes I have convergence where my motivation and my students' motivation is converging. We're working on the same page. We have the same ideas about what we want to do with the class and what we want to learn. We're tuned in. But there's also divergence when the students are not motivated. That can lead to the teacher losing their motivation. Similarly, a very motivated student comes into the class and sees this teacher really demotivated. The student will naturally lose motivation as well. So my research was looking at the dynamic link between teacher and student motivation, particularly through the concept of authenticity. So in my research, I started to look at authenticity as either a gap or as a bridge. But of course, not all bridges are equal, and there are crocodiles underneath some of them. I wanted to know, do you get back what you put into your lessons? If you're working really hard, are you likely to be reciprocated by the students also working hard? So I conceptualized this and I borrowed a term from ecology and physics called energy return on investment, ERI or EROI. So as I said, I took this term from physics and ecology. It's often used to explain the efficiency of fuels. So energy is defined as the ability to do work. And ERI is basically the equation that we use to calculate the returns on your investment. So what you get what you put in and what you get out. In terms of teaching, I apply ERI to refer to the amount of energy a teacher invests in the class and how much energy or work is returned by the students. Now, this is going to be very personal because obviously it's one of the most important things is how the teacher perceives the students. So the actual reality, of course, is very complex. It would be very difficult to ever fully understand the motivational landscape of a classroom with 25 people in context. So obviously this is about as much to do with the teacher's perceptions of this and how much they'll keep going. So if a teacher perceives her classes, her students are bored of her class, she's not going to plan the lessons as well or put as much work in as a sort of immunity response. And Phil Hiver talks about teacher immunity, and there's a strong link between that concept and my concept of energy return on investment. So I hypothesize that the way that social authentication, which is the link, whether it's a gap or a bridge of authenticity between the student and the teacher, I hypothesize that social authentication is forged if there's a high congruence between teacher and learners, creates a close synergy with reciprocal and mutually beneficial energy flow. In other words, if the students are getting it, then they love it, then the teacher's like, yeah, this is fun too, they enjoy my class, I'm going to put even more effort into the next class, and then the students reciprocate again, and you're on the same page and you've got this congruence. It's a very authentic class, and therefore it's very motivating. At other times, unresponsive learners mean that a teacher will naturally reduce the amount of energy they expend on a class, which in turn has a knock-on effect for everyone's motivation. So we've all walked into classrooms like this where you've got your students, you've got their heads on the table, and you think that they're not interested to be in your class. But of course, it's always more complex than that. They might just be tired. They might be worried about their dead hamster, etc., etc. But the theory is that if you can put in enough energy and motivate the students, they will reciprocate. But not all of them will reciprocate, but hopefully most of them will. And if that happens, then it's worth the job. This is a drawing that I had one of my students make in my doctoral research. One of the students, can you guess where he used to sit? Yes, right at the back. He drew this picture of a snake that is English and a frog about to be eaten. That was him. On the last day of class, after about a year of instruction, he drew a new version of the diagram. Same snake and frog problem, but this time the frog has a nice little fork to defend itself. I was so happy with that result, and I felt that was an achievement for me personally. So that's my motivational synergy. As I said, it was my whole PhD, and I've managed to cram it into about 5 minutes of slides. But please do check out my book. You can download it for free as a PDF on the Moodle if you want. One of the practical learning outcomes that came out of my doctoral research was the need to communicate your aims. You need to have very clear aims for the students, and you need to communicate those. So if you're doing an activity, you need to tell the students why you're doing it. Also include lots of reflection in the class, give them the opportunity rather, to look back at what they've done and think about what they want to achieve next. Give them chances to personalize the content and be more autonomous in what they focus on, and make sure that the students have their own goals as well. So you can't just tell them what to do, they should come up with their own ideas of what they want to achieve. As I said, knowing whether you have created motivational synergy is a bit difficult, but mostly this was something that teachers themselves will recognize and notice by taking what I called indicators. So when the students are working and they're on task and they're engaged, that's an indicator that you've got synergy. Knowing more about the group dynamics, knowing more about the individuals that make up the classroom group. Having empathy, of course, as I said, if humans are hardwired to try and read other humans' emotions, this is something that is a skill that you can develop, but humans are naturally able to understand how other people are feeling, and it's hard to hide how you're feeling. So I think that you can fairly reliably tell if someone's motivated or not. Intuition as well. This is again something that I've been researching more recently with Richard Sampson. We recently did a special issue of the Journal of Psychology for Language Learning that came out in 2023. So please do check that if you want to know more about intuition. But in terms of an indicator of synergy, it was simply a sort of tacit knowledge of whether the students are motivated or not, or whether they're synergizing with you. You can also tell from their performance if they do well in the class, if their ability with the language improves, and also vital is feedback from them and to them. If you don't have the flow of feedback, synergy breaks down incredibly quickly. So all of these things help indicate how much synergy you've got and where you are with your students. I proposed the language impetus triad, which is composed of authenticity, autonomy, and motivation. I think that you can't really understand one of these things without understanding the other, and they form this important Peircean triad. One of them is necessary for the other, I believe. It's similar to self-determination theory, I suppose, where you have these three: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. I think authenticity, motivation, and autonomy, they go together as a triad. It's very difficult to understand autonomy without also thinking about motivation and authenticity. They all need to be thought of holistically. Finally, in my book, I collected some vignettes from fellow teachers by posting on the IATEFL Research SIG's Facebook discussion group, and I got some really interesting vignettes from other teachers who also confirmed that they believe that energy is contagious, motivation can be spread through as an emotion, really. So I thought that there was definitely something there, and it wasn't just my observations on my classroom, but other teachers as well conferred. And I think that it's important to have things like regular progress checks in order to keep the perseverance up. It's important to note that motivation fluctuates. It's always up and down, always, even during the course of one lesson, your motivation is never constant. Hence, those meaningless graphs with quantitative data, they don't really tell the full picture of what's going on in motivation in a language learning classroom. It's really important to get down to context and to do things within your class that help students to understand their own motivation, understand that it's up and down, and how they can strategize that and keep themselves on track. Now, a related topic is willpower. And willpower is different from motivation, but I noticed that very few people link them up in the motivational research. So I wanted to just say a few words about willpower at the end of this talk. We're all familiar with the Stanford marshmallow experiment, where little kids are basically, why doesn't it work? I just want to shut the sound down. Okay, never mind. Anyway, little kids were given the option of having one marshmallow now or waiting for 10 minutes and having 2 marshmallows. And it's all about delayed gratification. So the students who chose to wait and were successful in not eating the marshmallow, a lot of kids said they would wait, but couldn't wait and ate the marshmallow and only got one. But the kids who successfully waited had strategies. They didn't look at the marshmallow. They put it away from themselves. They went and did something else and distracted themselves. Then 10 minutes went by quite quickly. So they followed these children into later life, and they made all these claims about the marshmallow experiment. Most of them have been proven to be exaggerated, to say the least now, but it's still an interesting experiment and it's worth looking into it. But things that will increase your willpower are proven to be exercise, meditation and mindfulness, training your willpower. It's possible to train yourself, lots of reflection, metacognition, measuring your progress and doing progress checks, avoiding distractions, getting lots of planning, and getting enough sleep. And these things will make sure that you're much more dynamic, motivated, and person with good willpower. So these are all things that if you already will have lots of willpower, you're already doing them. But if you don't have any willpower, of course, you don't get enough exercise, and you don't get enough sleep, you spend all night drinking and playing computer games, blah, blah, blah. So it's really annoying, actually, this slide. But I did actually do an experiment on myself. I read Kelly McGonigal's Willpower Instinct book, and it motivated me to actually start doing meditation and regular exercise. And I was pretty dynamic there for a few years, but then I lost it. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed learning about motivation. I'm sorry that I went so quickly. I know that everyone watches YouTube videos at 2 speed, so I thought I might just go at 2 speed anyway. I wonder how fast this is if you go watch it at 4 speed. Probably really fast. Anyway, goodbye. So yeah, thanks for your attention. See you later, alligator.